All right, gang, welcome back to Procreate. So in this lesson, we're going to combine three very mechanical, similar functions. We're going to talk about alpha lock, reference layers, and clipping masks. So this is something that a lot of artists don't understand, when to use what. So I figured we'd delineate these three tools all in the same section. Let's start with a reference layer. So I'm going to come in with my pencil here. Let's go ahead and just grab the studio brush. And let's go ahead and just create some sort of a very simple design. Let's go ahead and create maybe some form of a cherry blossom, right? Okay, let's go ahead, we can do better than that. Okay, so we can largely agree that this is an outline, right? We'll go ahead and rename, we'll call this outline. Okay, now what the reference feature is. I like to start my drawings with my outline, and so when I do that, I click on the gray, and I go ahead and I make this a reference layer. Now, when I go to fill the color, so let's say that I want to make a yellow center for this thing. Oops, let's go ahead and go yellow. If I click and drag, it will only fill the yellow center. Now, watch what happens if I don't make this a reference layer. Notice it says reference. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to turn that off. Now, if I try to yellow fill, it fills the whole thing, right? Because it doesn't see anything on that pixel layer. So for those of us that are illustrators, if you like to do your line work first, like myself, I like to use my reference layer for my line art before I do my base fills. Not always. I'm not going to tell you that I'm perfectly, committed to it. But if I'm doing editor backup. But if I'm doing a design that I like, I will usually do the outline first and then start coloring. So that's what a reference layer does. It tells Procreate, reference that layer in terms of everything else that I do. All right, now let's go ahead and do something different. Let's talk about alpha lock. Now to do this, I'm going to come in and I'm going to just paint this entire thing red. So I'm going to come in with my modified studio pen. And now another technique that I use is I fill in the entire base shape first. You guys saw me do that with the rose project that we did earlier in the class. So let's say that I have this. So I'm going to turn that off. We're now going to do something called alpha lock. If I wanted to shade this piece, anything that is outside in the white right now is what's called an alpha layer. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to click inside of here, and I'm going to alpha lock this. Now you'll notice up here, this changed to a checkerboard pattern. In digital art, there's something called an alpha layer, which is the transparent layer. If you do motion graphics, the graphic and then this corresponding space around it, the corresponding space around it is an alpha layer. Now, if I come into shade, so let's say I'm now going to shade this bad boy, and I'm going to do an awful job of shading, by the way. And now I want to shade. Notice that inside I'm shading, but watch what happens when I leave the red. Ooh, nothing gets outside of the red. Why? Because I told it to lock the alpha layer. So no pixel will be allowed outside of pixels that are already colored. This is a nice way to mask without having to use a mask layer. And if you're the type of artist that likes to work on one layer, say now I like to shade this thing and I like to smudge it and I like to do whatever, I can smudge away, and you see how my pencil's moving? It's not touching the alpha layer. So alpha lock is a nice way, if you're one of those people that likes to work in one layer, to make sure that once you have the overall shape, you're in good shape. All right, so that's what the alpha lock is. We know what a reference layer does. Now let's look at what is called a clipping mask. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to turn off alpha lock, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to come over to here, and we're going to create a new layer. And now what we're going to do is we're going to make what is called a clipping mask. Now what this is, you see the red shape down below? Click on it and this little caret thing, right? You see how it's pointing to the below there? Comes up. Now if I wanted to draw in green for whatever reason, watch what happens here. It's very similar to the Alpha Lock, but what it's doing, it's using this shape below as its clipping mask. So it's not really an Alpha Lock, it's a clipping mask because, watch this, if I decide to unclip it now, everything where I drew comes up. If I decide to clip it, everything where I drew is now clipped to only the pixel layers below it. So there's a non-destructive workflow, and we haven't talked a lot about that. Non-destructive workflow means being able to reverse course quite frequently. So when would you want to use a mask layer versus an Alpha Lock layer versus a clipping mask? And the short answer is, I use a clipping mask in order to work non-destructively. I also use mask layers to work non-destructively. Only in the most dire situation will I use the Alpha Lock, because let's say that my client didn't want black shading, they wanted something in like a tamer purple. I now cannot go back and reverse that black shading. I have to now scrap my entire image. So working non-destructively, I use the Alpha Lock least of all. My preference is to work in mask layers, but if I'm doing shading or highlighting of an image, I would prefer to use a clipping mask if I have a good base shape. We're going to be doing kind of a graffiti t-shirt illustration in the next sections here coming up. And in something like this, just to show you where I would use this, notice here, when I come into this new group, notice how I've got my base layer right here laid out. So I can really turn off every other layer. And when would I want to use a clipping mask? Quite frankly, when I have this sort of a base layer set up. Because now I don't want any of the later shading that I do going outside of that area. So this would be a good indicator for a clipping mask. And because I do a lot of my outlines first, if I wanted to, I could take that outline layer that I've got there, and then what I could do with it is I could create a reference layer and make the outline layer a reference layer, and I could color in underneath. So now you know what the Alpha Lock does, you know the purpose of a reference layer, and you know when to use a clipping mask. These techniques are going to be essential for the next area and the next projects in the course. That being said, let's go ahead and get into another project.